Hello. In this video, I'll be discussing why you should deadlift for bodybuilding or hypertrophy. So have a little bit of a structure to it, hopefully. Basically, the first point I'm going to make is that the deadlift is a decent hypertrophy exercise in of itself. It'll grow a bit of muscle. The second point I'm going to make is that a deadlift is a really, really good investment into your future as a bodybuilder, which we'll talk about and expand on a bit more. And then the third point I'm going to make is that the injury risk associated with deadlifts that a lot of people have in their mind is quite overblown and not really too big of a deal. So let's kind of take that point by point. So the first point is that the deadlift is actually a pretty good hypertrophy exercise. A lot of people will report, especially with higher rep deadlifts, that you actually will put on a fair bit of muscle. And the reason for this is because the deadlift just provides so much diffuse volume to so much of a body. Hamstrings, glutes, lats, rhomboids, spinal erectors, all of it. Even hip flexors. So the deadlift will grow a bunch of muscle in of itself. If you come to the gym as a beginner and you start with 60 sets of 10 on a deadlift and you work it up to 120 sets of 10 on a deadlift, you will be much more muscular. However, the flip side of that is the deadlift isn't the best muscle builder for any of those regions. And the reason possibly is because it's so general, it's not really that good at being specific. As an example, a better hamstring builder than the deadlift is probably a stiff leg Romanian deadlift, because now you get a stretch on the hamstrings, right? Which you don't get in a regular deadlift. And a better builder for the lats is any kind of vertical pulling. And a better builder for the rhomboids is probably any kind of vertical rowing. And a better builder for the glutes is probably like a single leg, squat, a Bulgarian split squat, or like a deficit sumo deadlift or something like that. But to grow them all at once, the deadlift does really work. And like I say, I think that example of the guy taking his deadlift from 60 to 120, I think that dude, anecdotally, would look like a different man. Much more muscular. So you can kind of see that the deadlift is a decent hypertrophy movement in of itself. It'll grow a decent amount of muscle, but you can maybe see with that comparison to other exercises that it's not really the king of any of them. But that kind of leads me to my next point, and I think probably a more important point, and why you should deadlift, is deadlifting is an investment in your future as a bodybuilder. And what I mean by that is that deadlifting unlocks and improves other exercises. As an example, the barbell row is an excellent, or the deficit barbell row, or the whatever, Smith machine deficit barbell row, any of that family of barbell rows, are beautiful upper back builders, but they require a strong lower back and a strong posterior chain to keep you in position. As an example, if you've only ever done machines, when you try a heavy barbell row, your upper back might be chilling, nowhere close to failure, but your lower back is going to round and fail because you haven't trained it. So that's one example. Another example is things like the overhead press, which require back stability and posterior chain stability. Another example is something like like a dumbbell row, which you might not think requires lower back, but does. Another example is your squat. Your squat's going to be massively improved if you don't have to worry about your lower back and posterior chain, and then you can just focus on the quads. Have you ever done a squat and you're like, oh, I can't wait for my quads to be on fire, but actually you find yourself failing the set because you're rounding over at the back and you can't hold the bar anymore? I have. But as my deadlift has improved, that happens less and less often. Also adding some heel support helps with that, of course. But just trying to think of any other examples of even like things as basic as even things as like a basic and seemingly random as like a calf raise. When you get really strong and you're doing 180 kgs on the calf raise, it's nice if you can also deadlift 200, because then you're going to feel that your back is strong enough to hold that weight. So the deadlift, I think, is really worth thinking about as like an investment into your future training. One I really forgot is all the deadlift variations. If you want to do an RDL, you want the RDL to remain a deadlift to target your hamstrings, right? Or maybe your glutes. What you don't want is for it to target your lower back. So if your conventional deadlift is 250, say, and now you're here RDLing 120, which is a decent RDL, right? You don't have to worry about your lower back's going to fail because you know you can deadlift 250. So yeah, I can't believe I forgot to mention that. All the deadlift variations, deficit deadlifts, RDLs, stiff leg RDLs, even good mornings, that's another classic one. Although it's not technically a deadlift variation, but you can kind of see it's in that family. Deficit sumo deadlifts for the glutes, all of them, if you have a strong posterior chain and lower back, it means that you won't fail there and you'll fail at the target muscle, which is so important for bodybuilding. One of the most important things for bodybuilding training is to choose a target muscle and to fail there, nowhere else. I made a video recently about grip training and how it's best to use straps or something so you don't fail at the grip, right? That makes sense to a lot of people, I think. But the deadlifting and getting strong with deadlift will mean that you won't fail at the lower back or posterior chain and exercises that you're not trying to focus those. T-bar row is another example. If you do a T-bar row, you don't want to fail at the posterior chain. And I'm sure you guys can think of even more examples of exercises that utilize lower back, but you're not trying to fail at the lower back. So yeah, and the deadlift basically, I guess I should round this out by saying that deadlifting frequently and heavy will make your lower back so much stronger, because the deadlift is the thing that you can lift the most weight on. So it's going to make your lower back so much stronger than it even needs to be for these other exercises, that you're going to be so far ahead that you won't even have to worry about it. So that's kind of the first two reasons. The deadlift will build just a decent amount of muscle in of itself, but also it's going to be an investment into your future training. Finally, there's a little bit of a stigma around deadlifting because a lot of people think it's got a high injury risk. I'll talk anecdote first, and then I'll give you a little bit of science because I was actually researching this. So anecdotally, I've not noticed for deadlift to be any more injurious than any other exercise. I've been training clients for a few years now. I have had one client injure themselves while deadlifting, but that was with 30 kgs while she was warming up. This is a 70 kg deadlifter. So I assume that, it wasn't the deadlift as such that did it. It was probably that she, something was wrong with her lower back already because she injured it with 30, And that's one client out of hundreds at this point, And of course, just being in and around gyms for ages, I haven't noticed a higher rate of injury on the deadlift than anything else. And of course, I've never been injured while deadlifting. But you might say, well, yeah, that's just a bunch of random anecdotes and personal stories, bro. Like, that doesn't say anything. And maybe you're right. So if you're more into the science side of things, I'll link a study in the description. And in this study, they questioned a bunch of powerlifters. And to be fair, powerlifters are not bodybuilders, it's different sports. But it's one of the only studies that's kind of done a direct investigation into people who actually lift, right? Not like beginners who've never lifted before. People who actually lift, like yourself, probably. You've probably been lifting at least for a little while. You're getting into it. So this study is done on people who actually lift. Look, you're not a powerlifter probably, but same ballpark. And what the study found is that only about 30% of injuries in powerlifting were from the deadlift. So that means it's slightly below average compared to because you'd expect, right? Powerlifting is 3 lifts, squat, bench press, and deadlift. So you'd expect them to kind of all be even, or if you want to argue the deadlift is more injurious, you would expect it to be maybe 50% deadlift injuries and then, 25% the other two. But as it turns out, the deadlift is actually slightly underrepresented. You could say, there's a bit of a margin of error, so say it's 1/3. That means it's the exact same injury rate as the squat and the bench press, which are 2 lifts that everybody says you should do, which of course you should. And no, I don't think anyone is really arguing that the squat is a super injurious lift. But as we can see from that powerlifting data, it seems to have the same injury rate as the deadlift. So that I think that kind of bears out my argument that the deadlift is no more injurious than other exercises. Look, it's not less injurious. It's not super duper safe compared to anything else either. It's just about the same, I think. And that study bears that out. One other interesting thing, just if you're still here about that study, is it showed that powerlifting is a very low injury risk sport in general. You're basically every 1,000 hours of training, you might get 1 injury, which is pretty good according to those numbers. So overall, not only, it's actually good to know that sort of thing, because if someone says to you, like, this is going to increase your risk of getting cancer by 1,000%, you're like, holy shit, I should never do that. But if your risk of getting cancer was only like, 1 in a billion anyway, you're like, oh, maybe it's not too big of a deal. And it's the same with deadlifting. Not only is deadlifting not a super high injury risk, but the whole act of lifting is not a very high injury risk activity. So it's an average injury risk amongst a low injury risk activity. So basically, not a very high risk of injury at all. And especially if you practice it and you could do it in higher rep ranges like bodybuilders would do, you'll probably find your injury risk is even lower. And that's just a well-known fact that higher rep ranges tend to lend to lower injuries, at least lower acute injuries, because you're using less load. So whereas a powerlifter may have a slightly higher injury risk because he's doing 100 maxes all the time, you as a bodybuilder are hopefully not doing 100 maxes all the time. You're probably doing minimum sets of 5, maybe sets of 4 perhaps. So your load is going to be a bit lower. So your risk of injury is actually even lower. So that's just kind of 3 hopefully convincing arguments of why you should deadlift. First of all, it builds a decent amount of muscle in of itself. Second of all, it's got an investment into your future training and will make your posterior chain and lower back stronger so you can be better at other lifts like overhead press, squat, and deadlift variations. And then finally, the risk of injury on a deadlift is actually not very high at all, no higher than any other lift. So there's no reason not to for that, like in that side of things. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and it made some sense to you, and I'll see you later.